Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 80. The Henty Brothers. The Henty family were the first Europeans to settle within the Port Phillip district of Victoria. The Henty brothers, including two sisters as well, were the children of Thomas Henty and Frances Elizabeth Hopkins. The Hentys were from Tarring, West Sussex in England. Thomas Henty came from a well-known Sussex banking family. Thomas inherited £30,000 and bought the sheep property generally called Church Farm at West Tarring, and he bred high-value merino sheep, some of which were purchased by capitalist entrepreneurs in the Australian colonies such as John MacArthur. After the economic downturn hit England in the mid-1820s, the eldest child, James Henty, thought that better opportunities existed in Australia. In 1829, James travelled to the Swan River colony, now known as today's Western Australia, with two of his younger brothers, Stephen and John. They had about 100 of his father's best sheep, horses and cattle, and 40 servants. Another brother, Edward, remained in Sussex. He was studying and he assisted his father with his business interests there. So once the brothers came to the west of Australia, they had a difficult time obtaining land grants. It had been found that there were serious misrepresentations that had been made in reference to the quality of the land, but due to the large capital that they had embarked, and the land grants they received, which totalled nearly 84,500 acres of land, they tried to give a go of it. But the land was ill-adapted for stock and utterly unfitted for cultivation. And after 12 months' residence, during which as much as £10,000 had been lost, it was determined to leave for Tasmania. They reached Launceston in the early part of 1832, but were too late to participate in the grants of land, which in the previous year had freely been made to all settlers. So they arrived in Tasmania with no unoccupied productive land available. Meanwhile, their father Thomas Henty decided to bring the rest of the family to the Australian colonies, selling most of his assets in England and sailing for Launceston. Thomas arrived in April 1832 with Edward and the three remaining siblings. Thomas Henty's sons were impatient. They could not farm on Van Diemen's Land, so they turned their attention to the opposite coast, the virtually unknown Port Phillip district of the colony of New South Wales, as it was at that time. Portland Bay had been a stopover for Edward on his journey to Launceston. The newly arrived Edward was sent to explore the coast of the mainland after the family settled in Launceston, and he reported that the district near Portland Bay had good possibilities, and after revisiting it with his father, it was decided that the land was suitable for settlement. They settled in the belief that they would eventually be granted the land. However, it was illegally. Edward Henty and his brother Stephen arrived at Portland Bay in 1834. Among the inventory of their ship, the Thistle, were labourers, bullocks, cows and pigs, along with baskets of tobacco, flour, potatoes, seeds, 2 casks of beef and 2 casks of pork. After a voyage of 34 days, the Thistle arrived at Portland Bay on the 19th of November 1834. Edward Henty said, "I stuck a plough into the ground, struck a she-oak root and broke the point, cleaned my gun, shot a kangaroo, mended the bellows, blew the forge fire, straightened the plough and turned the first sod in Victoria." A month later, the third Henty brother Francis arrived with Victoria's first merino sheep. He landed on the 11th of December 1834. Mr. Stephen and Mr. Thomas followed. Sheep were fetched across from Tasmania, pastures were occupied, houses erected and land cultivated. The Henty brothers also engaged in bay whaling at Portland in the 1830s. The whale oil and the baleen taken from southern right whales was shipped to Tasmania for export to London. Their father petitioned the British government 3 times to settle in Port Phillip in 1834, but he was rejected each time. The British authorities forbade the settling of land that was not easily accessible from Sydney. The father, Thomas Henty, died in 1839 in Tasmania, and it was not until 1846 that the matter was finally settled, and the Hentys were allowed £348 for improvements at the port and were granted 155 acres of land. The remainder of their land they had to buy at auction. The attitude of the government at Sydney to new settlers may be illustrated by an extract from the dispatch of the Governor, Sir George Gipps, to Lord John Russell, dated the 11th of April 1840. The Hentys claim to have rendered good service to the government and to the colony of New South Wales by opening a district of country which might otherwise have remained unoccupied for a number of years. But, so far from considering this any advantage, I look upon it directly as the reverse, not only because the dispersion of our population is increased by it, but because we are also forced prematurely to incur considerable expense in the formation of new establishments. I have already, in consequence of the proceedings of the Hentys, been obliged to send 2 expeditions to Portland Bay, and I am now under the necessity of organising a police force there, laying out a town, and besides incurring expense for the protection of the Aborigines. The thought that the many thousands of pounds spent by the Hentys in developing the country might eventually be of benefit to the state had apparently not entered into the minds of the authorities. Neither could have anticipated that the first sale of Crown lands, which took place a few months later, would yield a total sum of little over £17,000. Edward Henty was determined to continue with his settlement. His brother Francis had joined him in December 1834, and during the next 5 years other members of the family joined him, and gradually all of their horses, cattle and sheep were transferred from Tasmania. On the 29th of August 1836, the exploring party, headed by Major Thomas Livingstone Mitchell, reached Portland Bay and were amazed to find the country already colonised. In later years, Edward Henty was fond of telling the story of Major Mitchell when he came to the hut, from which blows of a hammer rang, saying, "Where is Mr. Henty, my man?" and the reply of the burly blacksmith, "Here he is, at your service." From Major Mitchell, Henty learnt the character of the land to the north, and gradually he was able to acquire more fertile land surrounding the Wannon River. The brothers established businesses, including the Munthan Pastoral Run, 57,000 acres to the north of this settlement, which was a very successful move, and by 1839 the Hentys possessed over 30,000 sheep and 500 head of cattle. In the 1840s, when land and stock prices collapsed, the Hentys faced financial ruin, but they did recover. They established stations as far north as Casterton and west to Mount Gambier. The Hentys actually settled Mount Gambier, but did not register it as a property and were displaced by Captain Charles Sturt's brother. The Henty Highway from Portland to near Hopkins is named in their honour. And in 1888, the town of Henty was proclaimed and named after Edward Henty, who had leased Round Hill Station just south of Henty in the early 1860s. The Henty run was known as Merino Downs and is still owned by the descendants from Victoria's first European settlers. The Hentys are now celebrated as Victoria's first settlers. The Australian Dictionary of Biography provides descriptions of Edward and Stephen Henty. It says, undoubtedly capable and energetic in youth, but excitable, and later socially ambitious and somewhat vain, Edward, Victoria's first settler, is popularly regarded as the chief actor in the early history of Portland Bay, but the backbone of the growing town and the first to set up stations inland was undoubtedly Stephen Henty. The monument found on a hill near Casterton on the Glenelg Highway commemorates the discovery and first European settlement in Portland in 1834 by Edward Henty and his brothers. The stone was laid in 1914, but the erection of the memorial was delayed because of World War I. It was unveiled on the 20th of November 1922. Plaques on faces of the monument also commemorate the mariner William Dutton, explorers James Grant and Thomas Mitchell. There was an article on the 8th of May 1914 outlining the event of the memorial in the southeastern border. The Henty Memorial celebrations passed off with great enthusiasm at Portland. The erection of a memorial to the Henty brothers, the pioneers of Portland, had met with general public favour. A visit of HMAS Melbourne was secured for the demonstration. The Mayor of Portland, in the presence of a large crowd, declared the foundation of the Henty Memorial well and truly laid on the spot where the explorer, Sir Thomas Mitchell, first met with the Henty brothers. There, the three brothers Henty landed and ploughed the first land so treated in Victoria. A procession of 800 children was a feature of the day. A torchlight procession took place in the evening. The march was from the town to the Friendly Society's ground where sports were held. and there is a Richmond Henty Hotel in the main street of Portland. So the Henty children, the firstborn James was born on the 22nd of September 1800 at Church Farm in West Tarring, Sussex, England. James joined the family banking firm until the families moved to Western Australia. James married Charlotte Carter in Fremantle, Western Australia on the 2nd of May 1831. In 1834, he visited England for the purpose of enforcing the claim of the family to a transfer of the grant to the coast of Australia, obtaining an indirect promise that his claim would be allowed from the Earl of Aberdeen. He then returned to Tasmania the following year and carried on business in Launceston for many years in conjunction with his brothers. In 1848, he again went to England with a view to the education of his family. During that period, happening to be present in the House of Commons on the night when the bill for the better management of the Australian colonies was under consideration, he was fortunately able to render such service by his local knowledge to Lord John Russell that the passage of the bill through the House became easy. The documents he presented cleared up an unexpected difficulty that had arisen during the course of the debate, and without them the bill would inevitably have been lost for a time. He received the thanks of Lord John for his services and also the offer of an appointment of Governor of Tasmania, which he refused. In 1851, Mr. Henty came to Melbourne, where he settled and at once engaged in business, founding the firm James Henty & Co. In 1852, after the separation from New South Wales, Mr. Henty was elected for Portland, for which town he sat until the inauguration of the new constitution, when he was elected to the Legislative Council as one of the representatives of the South Western Province. He represented the constituency until his death. He is one of the earliest promoters of the Melbourne and Hobson Bay Railway Company and was a director and chairman of the company. He was also connected with a number of monetary and insurance institutions, to the management of which he was always ready to give the benefits of his ripe and extensive commercial experience. He was liberal in thought, and though not taking a prominent position in politics, always gave his vote in Parliament on the side of progress and good government. So James died on the 12th of January 1882 in Richmond, Victoria, of a stroke. He was 82. James and Charlotte had 6 children. The first child, Henry, was born on the 9th of January 1833 in Launceston. He obtained his early education in Launceston, but later on went to England and completed his course at King's College. In 1856, he returned to join the family merchant firm, James Henty & Company, in Little Collins Street, Melbourne, and remained continuously connected with the company for over 60 years. He married Mary Ann McCullough at St Paul's Church in Geelong on the 26th of May 1859. They had 10 children. In 1865, he purchased 20 acres in Kew and built tarring on the land in 1872. This was a beautiful old home, and it's now called Henty House and is part of the Royton Girls' School. And there's a photo taken in around 1900 in Kew that I'll put on the Facebook page. So Henry over time gradually took over the management of the merchant business from his father, who died in 1882. And Henry had more than £90,000 in land and investments. He again went back to England and then returned in 1884 to find that his brother Herbert, who was managing the family business in his absence, had put the firm in difficulties. In 1885, the business had to be liquidated. They soon discovered through the liquidation that Herbert had squandered the business funds. Henry reformed the business in partnership with his brother Thomas and his uncle Francis. Henry was held in the highest esteem in business circles. He was chairman of the board of directors of the Colonial Mutual Life Assurance Society Limited for a number of years, and he was elected to the Legislative Assembly for Grenville in 1866. He was also chairman of the Educational Board. Henry was described by a friend as simple and trusting and the soul of honour. Henry died on the 20th of October 1912 at his home Tarring in Kew, aged 79. The second child, Herbert James, he was born on the 5th of October 1834 in Worthington, Sussex, England. In January 1859, Herbert was appointed Vice-Consul for Sweden and Norway at Geelong, and the appointment was received. Herbert married Frances Emma Murphy, the daughter of Sir Francis Murphy, a Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, at the Christchurch in Hawthorn, Victoria, on the 11th of April 1861. They were gifted a home in Kew from his father James as a wedding present that they called Roxeth. They had 4 children. In 1864, Herbert was elected as a member of the Kew Municipal Council and was Mayor of Kew in 1868. In 1881, he served on the Royal Commission on Education, and he was also president of the Melbourne Hospital from 1882 to 1885. And as earlier mentioned, in 1884, it was discovered that Herbert signed unrecorded guarantees in the name of the family's merchant business to the tune of £81,000. This included £33,000 handed over to the notorious Henry Franklin. Henry Franklin has a story of his own, so I'm going to be doing a bonus episode attached to this episode on him. In November, Henry filed his schedule in the insolvency court, and the firm's deficit amounted to £149,500. In May 1886, Henry was granted an unconditional discharge. So Herbert has declared bankruptcy. It all hasn't gone well in the business, and he's effectively been kicked out of the family business. By 1896, Herbert's living in Deniliquin in southern New South Wales, which is where he died on the 12th of August 1902. They did manage to keep the home Roseth. It was handed down to 2 of his children. There was a glowing obituary in a Deniliquin newspaper at the time of his death. Mr. Herbert J. Henty. It is with great regret that we have to announce the death of Mr. Henty that took place at his residence, Maroondah, in George Street, Deniliquin. The suddenness of his death came as a surprise to all, for he had that very morning been uptown for his mail and had, as was his customs, paid a round of calls to his friends. To all he seemed in the best of health and spirits. After taking some supper, he retired to bed and seemed quite well and cheerful. Almost immediately on reaching his room, he was seized with an attack of heart failure and in less than half an hour passed away. In losing Mr. Henty, we lose one of the best known and best beloved figures in Deniliquin. He inevitably made friends with all he came in contact, but especially he was the friend of children and young people. His kindly disposition, his large-heartedness, his purity and simplicity of character, and his capacity of interesting himself in the doings and sayings of even the youngest made him a favourite with the young. He had all the vigour and strength of a young man. Now death has taken him from us, and the cricket ground where he was a regular and interested spectator of local games will know him no more. The public school children, of whose board of advice he was chairman, will hear no more that voice which always, in happy strains, exhorted them to grow up to be good men and good women. Those who have known him intimately will bear his memory tenderly and reverently in their hearts for many years to come. Herbert James Henty was a second son of the Honorary James Henty, MLC of Victoria. He was born in England. He came to Tasmania with his parents at 2 years of age, but shortly afterwards the family came across to Victoria and settled near Portland. Later on, he was sent to England to be educated at King's College, London. On his return to Australia, he first entered the Bank of Australasia, which he left to enter the well-known firm of James Henty & Co. of Melbourne, of which he later on became a partner. In 1861, he married the eldest daughter of Sir Francis Murphy, who died in Deniliquin some 4 years ago. There were 4 children of the marriage, 2 sons and 2 daughters. One daughter became the wife of Dr. Embling, and one died soon before his father. Although Mr. Henty, before coming to Deniliquin, led an active business life, he found time to carry on a great deal of philanthropic and church work. For 21 years he was church warden, vestryman and lay helper at Holy Trinity Church, Kew, lay helper at the Christ Church and also at St Lawrence's. On coming to Deniliquin in 1896, he continued his work at St Paul's Church as lay helper and church warden. Mr. Henty also carried out the organisation of the first clergy to Fiji. Mr. Henty and his brother had a memorial window placed in St Paul's Cathedral at a cost of £500 and also gave £1,000 to found the Henty Scholarship. Mr. Henty was a Justice of the Peace for Victoria. Mr. Henty's remains were interred in the Church of England portion of the local cemetery. The third child, Thomas, was born on the 24th of August 1836 in Launceston. He was a grazier and he owned Pakenham Park in Pakenham, Victoria in 1869. He married Lucy Pinnock on the 9th of April 1869 at the Trinity Church in East Melbourne. Thomas was 32 and Lucy 19, and they had 10 children, and he died at his home Brockley in Middle Brighton, Victoria on the 22nd of September 1887, aged 51. And an article outlining his death, the death of Mr. Thomas Henty, MLC. We regret to have to record the death of Mr. Thomas Henty, which occurred at his residence at Middle Brighton. The event was not altogether unexpected, as the deceased gentleman had been absent from his parliamentary duties for some months owing to ill health. He was the third son of Mr. James Henty, one of the pioneer settlers of Australia. He was born in Sussex in 1836. He subsequently accompanied his parents to Victoria, where he has always been connected with pastoral and mercantile pursuits. Some 18 months ago, the old established firm of James Henty & Co. was dissolved, and he entered into the new firm bearing the name Henty & Co., which succeeded it. 2.5 years ago, he returned to the Legislative Council as one of the representatives of the Southern Province. A conservative in politics, he did not take a prominent part in debates. Mr. Henty's Victorian recollections dated back to early whaling settlement of his uncles at Portland, where he visited as a boy. He always took a warm interest in all that related to the progress of the colony and was a supporter of the turf, occasionally running a horse himself, though never with any distinguished success. And the fourth child, Frances Charlotte, was born on the 13th of June 1838 in Launceston. She married James Balfour in Victoria in 1859, and they had 11 children. She died at her home, Windella, in Kew, on the 21st of June 1925, aged 87. And James Balfour was a merchant, a churchman and a politician. He was Scottish, and he had some business background before going to London in 1848 from Scotland. And he came under the favourable notice of Hugh Matheson, who offered him a situation at Matheson & Co.'s corresponding house in Melbourne, which was Hart, Henty & Co. So in August 1852, Balfour embarked for Victoria. He impressed them, and in 1855, after working in Melbourne for the firm, he was appointed as a representative in Geelong for the business. In 1857, he went to Scotland, but he knew already that his future probably lied in Victoria, and the next year he returned, and on the 1st of April 1859, he married Frances Charlotte. With the closing of the Geelong establishment in 1863, he returned to Melbourne. He entered the Legislative Assembly in 1866 as a member of East Burke. In that year, however, he suffered an eye injury, which proved so troublesome that in 1868 he took his family on an extended European tour, and they returned a year later. Signs of strain appeared as James Henty bitterly opposed Balfour's journey to Europe, and in 1878 a crisis was precipitated by Henty's impending retirement. Henry, the first son, determined that his power in the firm should be absolute, and with the issues with Herbert, the partners were shielding creditors, and this forced Balfour to withdraw his capital in form of the company's station, Round Hill, north of Albury, and retire from the firm. Henry Henty first proposed that Balfour should turn to pastoral pursuits, but he insisted on his right to continue as a merchant. So after a short visit to England to secure financial support, he established his own company in 1879, and his eldest sons assumed the management of the property Round Hill. From the late 1870s, he joined various enterprises. He bought into suburban land speculation, and he also invested in Queensland sugar plantations. The fifth child, Emily, was born on the 14th of January 1842 in Launceston. She did not marry and died at her home, Richmond Hill, in Richmond, Victoria, on the 27th of January 1909, aged 67. And there was a note on her death that said the late Miss Henty used to take a very active interest in Richmond matters and in anything that would progress the district. In almost every charitable movement, the help of Miss Henty was among the first to be invoked, and in all genuine cases it was extended with a readiness that made it appreciated all the more. Her and her sister were the founders and executive officers of the first Richmond and East Melbourne Benevolent Society. In church matters, the sisters were always to the fore. They did services at St Stephen's Church. Emily was of an active, genial temperament, one who loved to be connected with good works, and was esteemed very highly for all that had the privilege of her acquaintanceship. For some years past, she'd lived in a retired life, peaceful and happy to the end, and her death in so short a time was quite unexpected. The sixth child, Susan, died at the age of 7 in Launceston in 1849. The seventh child, Mary Jane Henty, was born in Launceston in April 1846, and she married John Lepper Wilson in the Christ Church at Hawthorne in May 1882. She was 36 and John 55. They had one son, John Jr., and Mary died at Richmond Hill, Richmond, on the 29th of April 1921, aged 75. And there was a small article with her death passing of the pioneers. The death took place of Mrs. Mary J. Henty Wilson at her residence, Richmond Hill, Richmond, on Friday. She was the second daughter of Mr. James Henty, the eldest of the original Henty family, who settled in Portland in 1834. She resided continuously in the same house at Richmond since 1851, having been born in Tasmania in 1840. In 1882, she married John Wilson of the Customs Department. There is one son, Mr. John Arundel Henty Wilson, who was well known for his work among the Church of England soldiers' benefit activities during the war. So the second child in the Henty family was Thomas Oliver Henty, and he was born in 1802 in Sussex, England, but he died aged only 17 on the 28th of June 1819. The third child, another son, Henry, was born in 1803 and died in 1804 in West Tarring, Sussex, England. The fourth child, Jane, was born on the 24th of March 1805 at West Tarring. She married an Irishman, Samuel Bryan, on the 16th of October 1832 in Launceston when she was 27 and Samuel 38. Samuel was a wealthy landowner in Tasmania, and Jane died in Melbourne on the 8th of October 1893. They had no children. So when the announcement of her will and estate was in the newspaper in November 1893, it mentions that Jane Bryan, late of Selvington, Docker Street, Richmond, widow, left a will, the real estate valuing at £875 and personal money £1,445. She leaves the use of her late residence to her niece, daughter of her brother Stephen Henty. A block of land in Richmond Terrace, Richmond, is left to her two nieces, Mary Jane Wilson and Emily Henty, daughter of her late brother James Henty, for their use as tenants in common. To her nephew Henry Henty, she bequeaths £500 as a legacy, and in the event of his not receiving the benefit, it would go to his wife Marion Henty. She further bequeaths a specific legacy of £100 to Marion Henty, absolutely. She leaves £50 each to her nieces Eliza White, Susan Henty and Margaret Henty, and the sum of £50 is left to the Church of England Bishop of Melbourne's Fund and the residuary estate to Mary Jane Wilson. The fifth child, another boy, Charles Shum Henty, was born on the 24th of April 1807 at Church Farm at Sussex. He arrived in Launceston in April 1832 and he married Susan Bonifaci in Launceston on the 11th of November 1835, the daughter of Charles Bonifaci of Kinfield, Sussex. They had no children. As former manager of the Arundel branch of the Henty Bank at Worthing, Charles was invited to straighten the affairs of the Cornwall Bank and was appointed managing director and cashier of the newly established Launceston branch of the Bank of Australasia. He was recorded as residing at Warrnambool in 1847 and then returned to Tasmania, being a member of the Tasmanian House of Assembly in 1856, representing the Georgetown electorate. He died in Georgetown, Tasmania on the 18th of March 1864, aged 56. The sixth Henty son was William George, and he was born on the 23rd of September 1808 in West Tarring, England. He married Sarah Hopkins in Brighton, Sussex, England in 1828. Sarah died in 1846, and then he married Matilda Susanna Camfield in Sussex, England in August 1834. William and Matilda had 3 children, and the family came out to Australia in 1837. William adopted the law as a profession and was admitted to the bar in Australia in March 1837, and then he entered into partnership in a firm carrying on business as a solicitor for many years. Mr. Henty took a quiet though active part in matters calculated to benefit the colony. He was one of the founders of the Launceston Horticultural Society. So William was recorded as living in Portland in 1848, and he was actually colonial secretary in Hobart from 1859 to 1862. The family returned to England in 1862, where he continued working as a solicitor, and he died at Steyning, Sussex, England, on the 11th of July 1881, aged 72. Only one child out of 3 survived. The first child, William, was born in Sussex, England in 1835, and he died at the age of 2 on the voyage to Australia in 1837. A second child, Camfield, was stillborn in Launceston in 1837, and their third child, Matilda Mary, was born in August 1844 in Tasmania. She married Edgar Summers, a vicar in Sussex, England, on the 9th of August 1870. They had 5 children, and she died at their family home, Radley House, in Hampshire, England, in April 1911, aged 66. The 7th child, Edward Henty, was born on the 10th of March 1810 in Sussex, England. In October 1840, he married Annie Maria Galley at St James's in Melbourne. She was 11 years younger than him. Just after their marriage, the couple sailed to Launceston to meet his family before arriving in Portland. The couple moved to Muntham, a pastoral run of 57,000 acres, and the homestead was known for its generous hospitality. In William Westgarth's personal recollections of early Melbourne and Victoria, he writes about meeting Annie Henty at Muntham. Young, ladylike, beautiful, she received me with that high courtesy which sets one at ease by the flattering impression that in these squatting solitudes it is rather the visited than the visitors who are the obliged parties. Edward and Annie had no children. In 1855, Edward Henty was elected as a member of the Victorian Legislative Assembly for Normanby and was re-elected in 1859. Henty's last years were spent in retirement at his Melbourne mansion, Offington, and he died on the 14th of August 1878. Edward was known as a capable and energetic man and was regarded as the chief actor in the early history of Portland Bay. The 8th Henty son, Stephen George Henty, was born on the 3rd of November 1811 at West Tarring, England. He left for Western Australia with his brothers James and John in 1829, going to the Swan River on the Caroline. Stephen did make a couple of trips back and forth, putting into practice his navigational skills that he picked up on his voyage to Australia. It was in the Swan River where Stephen, aged 22, met 16-year-old Jane Pace, who had arrived from Yorkshire, England. Her mother carried a letter of introduction addressed to Stephen should she need help on her arrival. Stephen and Jane married on the 14th of April 1836 at Fremantle, and they soon set off for Portland Bay, where the Henty brothers had the whaling station and they established themselves as sheep farmers. Jane recalls in her memoir, she said, "My husband Stephen never rested until he had gone all through the interior, cut a track through 15 miles of forest land with 2 men and a dray, and arrived on the banks of the lovely River Wannon about sundown, grass up to his shoulders, exclaiming, 'This is paradise.' He lay down and slept till sunrise." Another of Stephen's expeditions is what is now known as Mount Gambier, and Jane noted that he was the first European to stand on the banks of Blue Lake. Stephen was also active in businesses in Portland as a merchant and a ship owner. Jane said, "My husband and his brother Edward were in partnership from boys and continued for years after, Edward managing the Muntham property and Stephen the mercantile part." Stephen was elected to the Legislative Council of Victoria in 1856, and Stephen and Jane spent much of their time at their home Findon in Kew. During this time in Melbourne, Stephen became one of the first members of the Melbourne Club. He resigned his parliamentary seat in 1870 due to ill health, and he and Jane retired at Tarrington, a property just east of Hamilton, where Stephen died 2 years later. Jane lived for a further 34 years after her husband. And Jane Henty is believed to be the first European woman to settle permanently in Victoria. She was the daughter of Captain Walter Pace of the East India Company's fleet. When Stephen and Jane departed Fremantle and arrived in Portland Bay in December 1836, she writes, "My husband and I arrived at Portland Bay in 1836, though he had made some trips previously with stock. It was on a Sunday night when we landed by moonlight. I was carried on shore through the surf by a sailor and safely landed on terra firma. On reaching the homestead, a comfortable dwelling composed of 4 rooms with kitchen and dairy, a bright log fire was burning, the table spread with a large pot loaf, butter, piles of eggs and tea. My brother-in-law, Frank Henty, met me at the door, saying, 'Welcome, Mrs. Stephen,' and I said, 'My name is Jane Henty, your sister.'" Stephen and Jane had 4 children. Richmond Henty was born in Launceston in August 1837, and he died in Croydon, Surrey, England, in April 1904, aged 66. Their daughter, Frances Elizabeth Henty, was born in Portland in March 1839. She married Mordaunt Smallpage in the Christchurch Hawthorn in June 1859. Mordaunt was a lieutenant in the Royal Navy before he settled in Victoria. They had one son, Francis. However, Frances Elizabeth died aged only 29 in November 1868 at Findon in Kew, Victoria. Mordaunt died only 3 years later, leaving their son Francis orphaned at the age of 11. The third child, Mary Jane, was born in Portland in 1841, and she died at Fendon in Kew in February 1859, aged only 18. And the fourth child, William, was born in 1854 in Portland. He married Sarah Birmingham at St Joseph's Church at South Yarra in August 1901, when he was 47 and Sarah 37. They had no children, and William died in Croydon, Victoria in October 1926, aged 72. The ninth child and eighth son of the Hentys was John. He was born on the 15th of June 1813 at West Tarring, England. He was the youngest of the brothers, and he married Eliza Whitfield, the daughter of Captain Francis Whitfield, in Van Diemen's Land on the 10th of August 1837. The family resided at Merino Downs near Portland before John was removed from the family business in 1842. They settled on a 12,000-acre station called Sandford, and John died in Western Australia in 1869, aged 56. They had 5 children: Eliza Whitfield Henty, who was born in February 1840 in Portland, Victoria. She married Thomas Edward White in Portland in February 1862. Thomas was a surgeon and died of tuberculosis in 1868, aged only 29, leaving Eliza with 4 children, 6 and under. Eliza lived in Armidale, Victoria, and died at her home, Udea, in July 1926, aged 86. Susan Goldsmith Henty was born at Port Fairy in May 1843. She did not marry and lived with her sisters, Eliza and Margaret. Susan died in August 1927, aged 84. Margaret Mears Henty was born in Port Fairy in February 1845. She did not marry and lived with her sisters, and she died in December 1924, aged 79. The fourth child, John Jr., was born in 1847 in Victoria, and he died in 1884, and his death says, Henty, on the 9th of April, on board the Ringarooma, of general debility caused by seasickness and exhaustion, John Henty, in his 38th year, manager of the Bank of New Zealand, George Street Branch, Sydney, son of the late John Henty of Portland and formerly of Western Australia. And the fifth child, Edward, was born at Woodford, Victoria in March 1850. He married Fanny Jebb at St Mary's in Waverley, New South Wales in March 1875. They had 3 children, and Edward died in January 1880 at Merino Downs, aged only 29. Fanny died only 6 months later, leaving 3 children, 5 and under, orphaned. So they didn't have much luck. They had 2 daughters that didn't marry, a son that died quite young, and out of the 2 that did have children, both of them died very young. And the 10th child, the youngest of the family, Francis, was born on the 30th of November 1815 at Field Place, Sussex, England. He arrived at Portland Bay on board the Thistle at the age of 19. He and his brothers established the farm they called Merino Downs. Frances married Mary Ann Lawrence in 1842 at Launceston. Initially, she was to reside in Portland, but this meant being away from Francis, so she chose to live with him at Merino Downs. Mary Ann had to adapt to a life of relative isolation with infrequent visitors. They had 4 children and lived at the homestead for over 30 years before relocating to Melbourne in 1876. Frances died in January 1889 in Kew, Victoria. Their children, Lawrence Shum Henty, was born in Portland in 1845, and he died on the 10th of February 1877 at Merino Downs, aged only 32. And it was mentioned in a couple of articles, one from Hamilton. Intelligence was received here today of the death from apoplexy on Saturday of Lawrence Henty, the only son of Mr. Frank Henty of Merino Downs. The gentleman was in the township on Monday and Wednesday. On the first day, no one could be livelier, but on the Wednesday he did not appear like himself. He had to walk with a stick, and he said he was very unwell. On Friday night late, he had a fit, and Dr. Smith was sent for. Before that gentleman arrived, he was attacked with another fit, and on Dr. Smith's arrival, he had a 3rd fit, followed by a 4th, in which he died early on Saturday morning. Louisa Henty was the second child. She was born in August 1847 in Portland, and she died in 1924 in Kew. She did not marry, and there was information regarding her estate. Miss Louise Henty's estate bequests to charity. Miss Louisa Henty, late of Studley Park Road, Kew, and Merino Downs Estate, Henty, who died on July the 2nd, left an estate valued at £145,816, consisting of realty of £96,200 and personal funds of £49,500. The will provides for considerable devices and bequests to relatives and friends and certain payments to employees, and a bequest of £500 to the vestry of St Paul's Church of England, Henty, for rebuilding purposes. The residuary estate is to be held in trust, and one half of the net annual income paid in such proportions as the trustee shall deem proper to the Austin Hospital for Incurables, Children's Hospital Carlton, Women's Hospital Carlton, Melbourne Hospital, Bush Nursing Association, District Nurses Association, Old Mission to the Streets and Lanes of Melbourne, Casterton Hospital, Hamilton Hospital, Portland Benevolent Society, Victorian Homes for the Aged and Infirm. The remaining half of the net annual income is to be dispersed among charities in general, including those already specifically mentioned. So quite a wealthy woman upon her death. The third child, Caroline Agnes Henty, was born in August 1849 in Portland. She married Alexander Magnus MacLeod in August 1890. Alexander owned a farming property, Taliska, and he was also a politician. And she died in October 1914, aged 65. And the fourth child, Alice Henty, was born in April 1852 and died in 1932 in Kew. She did not marry. So there's certainly a legacy of the Henty family, definitely very influential pioneers, particularly in the state of Victoria. And there are many that are descendants of the Henty family today.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.